I did that. Okay? Okay, right? So a motion that this House believes that leaders of minority religions in Europe should strongly encourage their congregations to refrain from public displays their faith. The House invites the Prime Minister to defend the motion that stands in his name. First,
there has been an undeniable growth in the number of hate crimes and intolerant acts towards religious minorities in Europe. From simple things such as being ostracized in the playground by your fellow peers, to really big things like being beat up in the middle of the street because of your difference in religion. We think, ladies and gentlemen, it has grown to a point where even several seats in Parliament have become won by explicit neo-Nazi parties. We think these drivers of intolerance were massively due to two important factors that you have to take into consideration. Firstly, the economic downturns in Europe, ladies and gentlemen, as well as to the massive influx of migrants and refugees in the area. We think more often than not, the Europeans would blame this downturns or these forms of commiserations and costs towards these religious minorities. And the solution, ladies and gentlemen, that leaders ought to take is that they should encourage their followers to refrain from public displays of their faith. Sit down. So what are we fighting for? What are we okay with? What are we not okay with? Three things. Firstly, we would actively discourage our followers from practicing their religion in public spaces. This includes articles of clothing, ladies and gentlemen, as well as prayer and devotion in parks, in buildings, or in other places known to be a public zone. Second, we would encourage, ladies and gentlemen, for them to practice their faith privately in private spaces, either in holy grounds in churches, as well as in their own homes as groups, ladies and gentlemen. But third, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, given that this is the context of the debate, we would be okay with them practicing their faith in public later on or in the far future if circumstances permit and if the public sphere, ladies and gentlemen, lets up, given particular discussions that I've already framed in this debate. So I'm going to talk to you about two things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you how it leads to more tolerance for religious minorities. And secondly, I want to talk to you about on a more individual level, how it improves the overall holistic quality experience of life of these religious minorities in their day-to-day experience. Let's talk about the first idea. How does this lead to more tolerance for religious minorities? Here's the first premise. We think that the goal of any religion is so that individuals can practice their faith and be able to act as a community. But we think that that sort of goal competes with the culture of secularism, ladies and gentlemen, that has already been espoused in Europe. Evidenced, ladies and gentlemen, by France banning the burqa or the wearing of the burqa in public. We have two reasons why this leads to more religious tolerance given this context. I'll take you up to this first argument. First, it allows for a more gradual acceptance of these individuals, building on relationships and experiences that can be fostered if they do not see stark differences on the onset of that experience. What do we mean by this? The crowd, ladies and gentlemen, in Europe is made out of conservatives, liberals, and moderates. Okay. But more often than not, ladies and gentlemen, their first and initial interaction with these religious minorities is to find stark differences if they allow public displays of their faith, if they're wearing something inherently different from the secularism and the non-religiosity that is practiced within Europe. More often than not, that leads to motivations for them not wanting to interact with them or staying away from these individuals at the end of the day, not finding the points of commonalities we think that is inherent within all human beings that can be found within any form of human interaction. What happens on our side? If individuals blend into the secularism that is practiced and espoused by the governments of the European countries, then it is more likely for these religious minorities to be able to blend, making relationships, come up with meaningful experiences with these individuals at the end of the day that they wouldn't have had otherwise. This is important, ladies and gentlemen, because once you establish that relationship, once you establish that sort of tolerance and importance towards that relationship and meaningful interactions, That's when they can tolerate more the differences that you have with your lifestyle choices and with your culture at the very end of the day. Once those relationships are built, it is much easier to forward and espouse your differences towards them. We think that is important. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we think any other alternative to fight for tolerance is costly and much harder, and in fact, nearly impossible to occur. If they are to say, ladies and gentlemen, that it is important to show your faith in order for us to fight these forms of secularism and intolerance, it is very hard, because what you have to do is appeal to the authority, appeal to governments and legislatives, which cater mostly to the majority, which, ladies and gentlemen, appeal or fight for secularism at the end of the day. We think, ladies and gentlemen, it's very hard to fight the legislation or fight for legislation if you are a religious minority because of your lack of political clout. Any protest, anything you do in public will be met with a brick wall, and we think the best way to get moderates and these individuals fighting for more acceptance and more laws for your side is to build relationships first, rather than fight for legislation first at the end of the day. We think that this position is more strategic. Before I move on, closing.
If these types of differences are so important, how is it you're excluding the majority groups being able to do the exact same representations? Or is there a suggestion that they're also going to make the Catholic Unionists of Ireland take away crucifixes from the doors of all Catholic households?
Yes, we would prefer that, ladies and gentlemen. We would prefer a world or a public space where individuals do not usually practice their forms of devotion in public on the onset, because we think, ladies and gentlemen, once there can be a formation of commonality, that's when these things can be easily more tolerated. Second idea, how this will improve the overall holistic quality of life experience that these individuals have. More than religion, ladies and gentlemen, we think that every other individual who lives in Europe should be able to practice other aspects of their life, and we think the public space is a unique, neutral area that allows for this to be so. Before ethnicity, before religion, we think that the public space, or what secularism provides, and what these leaders then provide to their followers if they do encourage them to do so, is for them to see themselves as humans first, rather than their other sorts of qualities that are before them at the end of the day. That move, ladies and gentlemen, allows these individuals experiences such as making friends, being able to work properly, being able to be in a relationship with someone, which wouldn't have been available and accessible to them otherwise. These leaders, ladies and gentlemen, are therefore in a unique position to encourage those levels of experiences which would not have been experienced if they continuously, frustratingly, forwarded the idea that they should be openly public with their devotion towards their God. We then, ladies and gentlemen, this is secondly furthermore important, because public displays are not essential, and we would like to argue, to the core of any religion that is forwarded. More than symbols and more than traditions and practices, the meaning behind these traditions, I think, are better preserved upon private convergence, upon understanding more than the qualities that are external. The internals are that much more that are focused. For all those reasons, we are very proud of propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the speech. I'd like to invite the Leader of Opposition.
We thought it strange that the entire end goal of Prime Minister's speech, so that eventually you'll get the very laws that respect religious tolerance, when the very foundation of the relationships he was talking about is that your religion is not very important to you, such that you can hide it in the moment you get to the public sphere. We think that very foundation makes it so that you allow the majorities to entrench themselves, allow the majorities to still be able to express themselves publicly, and to the extent that there's a stark difference, it's to say that minorities will never be able to experience the same level of privilege that these majorities have. I want to have a couple of extraneous responses before we move on to our stance. One, the extent that we're talking about refugees and like the the problems that Europe is undergoing right now, we don't understand how relevant they are to the debate. Given that we look at refugees, it's not just a religious line, but it's an ethno-racial line at that. So if these refugees stop expressing themselves religiously, it's not as if people can still hate them and can still pin that hate to certain ethno-racial lines. The fact that most of these are from the Middle East, for instance, or the fact that most of these are Arabic people. So to that extent, we would say that even enabling or worsening that very oppression they're talking about. What we would say about religion in enabling the fight against refugees is that the more affluent and more powerful members of your minorities that aren't necessarily in the same situation of the refugees can be the main bulwark in fighting against that oppression for the refugees. But second, there was absolutely no analysis coming from Prime Minister as to why the gradual acceptance is eventually going to lead to the long-term changes that he was talking about eventually. The foundation of the relationship is trust, that you can hide your religion, that your religion isn't that important to the extent that the public sphere is essentially concerned. So there's absolutely no reason that the moment these people start fighting for more public displays of their religion, that these people are going to magically accept them. In fact, more likely we would say these people would feel betrayed. These people would feel as if that acceptance, those social terms that they initiated at the beginning of the relationship, are essentially betrayed by the very relationship that JB wanted to talk about. So what we support is not to say that all people must publicly express themselves, but to say that religions or the leaders of these minority religions must not discourage, but rather must enable these people in the expression of their faith. And it's not like the very big notion the Prime Minister wanted to talk about. It's not just saying that, hey, I'm a Muslim, guys, here's a walking tournament of me being a Muslim. But it's about what you wear. It's about how you project yourself. To that extent, these are all very important religious symbols that these people must be able to hold and must be able to publicly express.
Sure, you're missing the second part of the analysis. How do you fight for legislation on your side? Religious minorities have little to no resource, and a famous person that could fight for you is 1 in a million.
That's excellent, but the main premise I want to be able to challenge right now is the fact that only the minority religions within themselves can fight for tolerance. We think this is ridiculous because most of the impetus against the ban of the niqab in France wasn't coming from just Muslims or wasn't coming from just Muslims in France, but was coming from a greater international community predicated on the fact that religion is important to these individuals, which is a crucial premise that is absent from government bench. First question on justice. We find it strange that the only question that open government wanted to ask was, how do you get rights for people on the ground without necessarily asking who absorbs the cost for the justice and the persecution that they themselves wanted to talk about? We would say, coming from opening opposition, that persecution is never the fault of the persecuted. That if someone oppresses you, then you mustn't limit the ability of these people who are persecuted to be able to express themselves, to be able to own up. To that extent, we would say it's a crucial harm that people feel that a large part of their identity is not being able to be expressed anymore, precisely because of the very persecution that they want to talk about. But on a more pragmatic level, we would say they are weakening, and this is the response to the POI, they are weakening the ability of state and civil society to be able to forward the very rights you wanted to talk about. Because the message that you're sending is that religion isn't that important. It's something that you can sacrifice the moment you go to the public sphere. So it's not really important for these individuals to be recognized by the very religions that they are. But second, we say they're weakening the impetus internal to the religions themselves, to the extent that they're internalizing the very oppression that these people feel. If you're a religious leader who you rely on as the bulwark of support in these very difficult times tells you that you can hide your religion, you can hide your hijab, you internalize that oppression and accept that maybe the second-class status, which opening governments has also already existed, might be a permanent part of the first place. We would say on the comparative, that justice is valuable even insofar as people are hurt, even insofar as people are oppressed, that they remain firm in the fact that they don't have to take accountability for that is something that we support. The comparative is the perpetual injustice will remain so without any analysis coming from opening government versus the short-term harms that brave people under our side have to absorb. It's not everyone, but the very bravest. Second, what is the role of leaders? If you contextualize society as various pressures to be ashamed of you being who you are, then there's absolutely no reason why the leaders must emulate the very various pressures that society is already imposing on these individuals. The crucial premise is that your friends in the playground are telling you that you should be ashamed of being Muslim. But to the extent that now the religious leaders are echoing the very same sentiments, we think that's particularly problematic. The role of the people or the religious leaders we're talking about, the clerics, the imams, is to galvanize the very religions with regard to the support. But what they're essentially doing with regard to their side is feeding into the very rhetoric that religion is something to be ashamed of, and that you have to accept the very second-class status at the end of the day. What we're doing under our side is that even if we are not able to fight for the long-term change on our worst case, leaders remain as the bulwarks of support for these people. That your religious leaders are never going to tell you that your religion is something to be ashamed of, that your religion is something that you mustn't essentially be proud of, that we are going to tell you to be ashamed of that religion. Third, how do you fight oppression and foster interfaith dialogue? We'd say a large part of the oppression is because of an incapability of people to see the innate humanity, we agree, but the innate humanity of these people insofar as the religion as an important part of their identity. This is why we would say shutting out the public expressions that they wanted to talk about is going to reinforce the default assumptions that everyone in Europe is Christian, everyone in Europe is Catholic. So when you're interacting with another person who doesn't have any religious garbs on him, it's not as if you're treating that he might be Muslim, but you're thinking that the very default assumptions that are in status quo, the majorities are going to be reinforced. That's why we would say that there is no acceptance that you get coming from their side. Conversely, we are enabling them to challenge this bias. The reason why we were so outraged about the kid who brought the watch to school, who happened to be Muslim, a crucial part of that was understanding that there are intersectionalities to those biases. The fact that Muslims are more likely to be treated worse than anyone else in society. But shutting out the public experience, shutting out the public expression of that means that you treat everyone as beige. You no longer get to see the very intersectionalities, the very important pressures that individuals who are from these minority religions get to face in the first place. We thought it strange that they said that the end goal is acceptance, but they were going to say that the protection of people right now is more important than that. Extremely proud of us.
Cool. Thank you, the opposition. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Expressions of one's faith are important, and it's regrettable that it's sacrificed from time to time. But religion has always made sacrifices in terms of its practices, especially when they recognize a bigger human value, like life. That's why they stopped the Crusades. That's why there are fatwas issued condemning violent expressions of jihad, because they understand that there's no absolute way that you can express your religion. And this debate is a question of whether or not it is once again time to recalibrate and reassess the values of your religion and how you ought to express this religion in the public and private sphere in a context of a frightened Europe. What do we want coming from side opening government? In as much as we want freedom, we understand that if you don't even live long enough to see society open up to you because you were beat up or killed, then you won't be able to experience that freedom at all. We want to reach that initial phase of tolerance and cohabitation in such diverse communities because we understand that it's important to achieve this before you exercise any true religious expression anyway. The parallelism is simple. If you're a gay man in somewhere like Indiana, you don't hold your own gay parade and dress up flamboyantly because chances are you're going to be shot. We want to discourage individuals from projecting themselves as social battering rams because not everyone in their religious group is able to handle this. I'm going to respond to a few things before arguing. Sit down. The first is this idea coming from Leomar that we entrench the suppression of religious minorities, and people will eventually feel betrayed when they find out that they're from a different religious group. This is ignorant of JB's analysis when he said that the gradual acceptance happens because there's no initial barrier. Because when they see that you are the same person as them, or you are just as human as them, without seeing any identifier that says you are different, then chances are the default assumptions that Leomar are going to give you are good things. Because at that point, wherein he realizes that you're someone who has a different belief than him, it's already too late to exclude you. Because you've already initially found points of commonalities that help you recognize that person's humanity. Sit down. But what did he say in response to this? He said that they look physically different anyway. First of all, that's not automatically true. If you look at Middle Easterns, they look very similar to Eastern Europeans. So they might not be able to automatically identify you as someone who's different. Sit down. But second, what people conflate with things like terrorism are things like religion, because ISIS is going under the banner of Islam right now. So if they see an Islamic symbol, that's what alerts people to the fact that you might be a danger to them and I ought to exclude you. It's not necessarily your race. But the next thing they told you is this idea that the persecution is not the fault of the persecuted. And we agree with this completely. But how do you respond to the actual persecution that's happening right now? Sit down. Because if you look at the state's duty to protect you, we have three responses. First, you're not always a citizen yet. So the state might not have the duty to protect you already. But second, the state can protect you at all levels of interactions. There are always going to be those microcosms of society where the state cannot enter and calibrate whether or not you're wrong or right. For example, when you're applying for a job in the workplace, if he rejects you, there's no possible way that you can say that you were rejected on the basis of your race or religion. So the state cannot police all of that. But lastly, Leomar, the state is not a monolith. That's why JB's analysis was important when he said that the state is being injected with neo-Nazi parties right now. So you also have members of the state who are against you. So you can't rely on the state alone to be able to protect you. Lastly, they said that you internalize the second-rate status of these individuals. No, what they're internalizing on their side is that their humanity is contingent on their expression of religion, and we're going to disagree. And that's why I'm going to answer this question of, can public displays of faith actually be divorced from their actual faith? But before that, go ahead.
We stop the crusades and jihads not because they're public, but because they're violent. But insofar as most people see religious expression as violent, is it important that a counter-narrative of peaceful expression be there?
No. Because you have rational people who will not kill you in the event that they see you wearing a hijab. But you also have irrational individuals who are likely to beat you up if they see that you are someone who is religiously different from them. So if you look at it, what we'd say is we disagree that your exercise of your faith ought to be the reason why people be violent, but they're being violent anyway. So you can't be idealistic, and you have to respond to the current context that these religious minorities are facing. And that's why we have to ask, can public displays of faith be divorced from their actual faith? And this is a response to Leomar's argument about how it's important to you. Yes, wearing a hijab or wearing a rosary around your neck all have nothing to do with your inherent humanity. How well you behave or follow the tenets of your religion are not dependent on such public displays. But even if they were intrinsic, that's where the leaders of minority religion comes in. Because religion has never been stagnant, ladies and gentlemen. They always evolve with the times. Because people will only keep believing if they find religion to be relevant to you. And who propels the direction of these changes? It's always these religious leaders. And that's where their role comes in. That's why they have to tell you that you have to refrain from public exercises of your faith because you are in danger. And the question now that has to be asked is, why must religious leaders propel their congregation in this particular direction? And this is where JB's characterization of the European culture comes in. But the second and more important thing is because of the growing threat to you in Europe, because of the amount of xenophobic tendencies that people have been seeing resurgent in society right now, because of the influx of refugees that people think might steal their opportunities. What's the problem here, and how is this seen? Well, if you look at it, there are already neo-Nazi parties being voted in Bulgaria, Australia, or Croatia, and there are rises in instances of hate crimes. What's the point? There's a growing danger, and public displays of faith alert them to the difference that strikes that danger to reality. What we'd say is, in light of this, do we, as religious leaders, prioritize the safety of our people or their expression? And this is where we say safety has to be prioritized because of three things. First, you cannot express your religion if you are dead or seriously maimed or injured. Second, you endanger other people of your faith as well if the society you are in is agitated by your public expression. And that's unfair to the rest of the people who belong to that religious minority who aren't so willing to take the social persecution and who are willing to give up parts of their religion in order for them to be welcomed in society so that they can feed their families or they can get access to jobs that will give their families a better future. But lastly, it endangers the political will to help your homes or help other Islamic countries because people from that community are conflating their hatred of you to their hatred of those countries. And this is particularly important because these are the countries that give aid and give military intervention to those countries who constantly face such dangers. What we'd say is, as a religious leader, your duty is to encourage your congregation in that direction in order to keep them alive. What do we want? We want freedom, but the first thing we want is to keep you alive and safe. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Parliamentary. I'll invite the Deputy of Opposition to close the opening half of this debate and prepare Jennifer sheets.
This debate is not about individuals who are willing to sacrifice their religion and hide it, because obviously they won't be harmed if they continue to hide under the state, right? We think, ladies and gentlemen, this debate lies with individuals who feel so strongly about these public displays of their religion. Because what you need to understand, Andre, is that it might not be the religion itself, but it is a consequence of your faith. Which means that, to an extent, it only is the rational extent of how people decide among themselves how important that religion is to them. So if your religion is particularly important to you, and the practice of that religion is so important to you as well, why should you be able to divorce them and not practice them as a whole? We think that, one, this entire concept of, well, you conflate them with terrorism, that's why you need to and ought to exclude them, is essentially wrong, particularly because you need to be able to create a counter-narrative. This is why the peaceful expression is so crucial to balance that kind of idea. That is also why people essentially understand that not all women who wear hijabs, for example, or not all men who wear the clothes of Muslims are particularly jihadists. That's why opening government, you need to realize that what you do under your model is that you lessen the threshold of these neo-Nazis individuals or these people who discriminate so much, particularly because the things that can change their mind in the long run are already hidden from their eyes. That's why it's so hard for them to change under your model. But you need to look at this entire concept of, well, they're irrational people, so they're going to die. One, individuals who are irrational can always be penalized by the state. But secondly, if you want to think that that irrationality is a problem, the question is how you curb that irrationality in the future. Sure, there are individuals who might have to die or who might have to penalize. But to an extent, you're going to argue that when it comes to religion, individuals, and some of them, would rather die than take away parts of their religion. That is why, if you look at historically, individuals will always say, it's okay for you to die, it's okay for you to be a martyr, just don't revoke your faith in Jesus Christ, or just don't revoke your faith in Allah. We think, ladies and gentlemen, those are important nuances that people will have to recognize, because it's not always that individuals will want to take away bits and parts of themselves to be safe. But we're going to say, and we're going to argue, that individuals would rather be persecuted just so people in the future of the same race and of the same belief will be able to obtain a lot of benefits in the past, such as tolerance and such as acceptance. We think, ladies and gentlemen, this entire concept of, well, there's going to be a stark difference and there's going to be an initial response to it is true to some extent, but at least now there's a level of expectation that you can set on how people treat you. I.e., for example, if you wear a hijab, it's not okay for individuals to just randomly say that Islam is bad, but they can be able to say that there are several expectations of how they treat. But more importantly, I'm going to argue later on why that acceptance or that physical aspect is so important, so you recognize the gradients of how people exercise their religion, and it's necessary to keep on pounding that ceiling glass. But secondly, in this concept of, well, they're going to blend in them and they're going to come out in the future, it's extremely hard to buy, particularly because, one, you need to analyze that if individuals are born and bred in a secularist environment, they're more likely to espouse that secularism, and it's going to be harder for them to come out in the future. Particularly because, one, if there's so much secularism, the bits and pieces of how you practice your religion is frowned upon, you're never going to be able to want to change that in the future. So all your benefits, guys, will never happen. But sure, Rashad.
Do you understand that the nuances that says that in the except of a hijab, you're not a Muslim or you can die for Allah, is a nuance that is created by the society, and it's not absolute binary under the spectrum of religion.
Right. So if your idea is that the society creates this entire discrimination, we say that it's important that society recognizes how to change that particular event in the long run. This is why I will argue to you how we create the link towards religious tolerance. And we're going to concede that at some extent, into a certain time frame, people are going to suffer. One, we're going to say that public displays are crucial, particularly because these are the forms of practice of religion that can be digested by random individuals, which means that the physical aspect is so important for people to treat you as a Muslim. What we're going to say is, in the gradients of how you practice your religion, public displays of that is at the far end of that gradient. It's not the extreme yet, right? So it's just the far end. We're going to say, ladies and gentlemen, that in the extent of being able to normalize the far end, everything else in the and moderation will also be easier to be digested. That's why, for example, if you look at the gay movement, it was so easy for people to wear bras and remove bras all of a sudden. But individuals or gay people who are extremely moderate became acceptable to the rest of society. This is particularly a crucial analysis, because in the same way that you breed tolerance for the physical aspects, you also breed tolerance for the little and subtle forms of how religion is treated, i.e. normal conversations about Allah, or how, for example, individuals don't want to eat pork. These are the kinds of little nuances that people will also need to feel as if it can't possibly happen under your model. This is a direct response to the concept of stark differences. Because we think, ladies and gentlemen, that the link to this is that the more we derive leaders who say that it's okay to fight for these kinds of instances, the more we create a movement in those religions in themselves, ladies and gentlemen, to continue to want to fight for other people. But secondly, what I'm going to argue is that it's going to be, thank you, a bastardization of your own cultural identity as well. If you look at it, the premise of the argument is this. If you look at minorities, religion is what defines most of how they essentially try to proliferate their culture. These are two things you can't divorce. So the inability for you to practice your religion also means there's an inability for you to practice your culture as well. And these are the kinds of things that the leaders of the religious sectors shouldn't be able to want to have, particularly because religious leaders are also cultural leaders as well. And we're going to argue, ladies and gentlemen, that your culture is so important to your dignity as a person. But lastly, more importantly, we're going to argue that why the need to adapt to the public sphere is important for us to correct the oppressive religions in society. We're going to concede not all religions are perfectly okay, and to some extent, some religions are bad. But you think, ladies and gentlemen, that when you don't allow them in public spaces, it's easier to curtail their oppressions in private spaces. This is why it's important to have check and balance mechanisms in those kinds of areas. Because if people get to create discriminatory policies or oppressive policies out in the open, it's easier to police them. And the important nuance of this is, it's not going to be just within Europe, but almost every part of society where the Muslims are. That's why a lot of people in Europe, for example, lack the lobbying power for other individuals as well, because they don't want it. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, if, for example, leaders say this, we're going to say that individuals have a race to the bottom, which means that individuals who are practicing that religion will not want to fight for their religion as well. Not particularly because society will shun them now, but even the members of their own religion will shun them. Those are particular nuances of how important a statement of a leader is. For all these reasons, we're extremely valuable. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Deputy Opposition. Now we will be closing how to participate the House of Head of Government, who is supposed to be known as a Leads.
The agreed outcome of this debate is a future where there is an integrated, meaningful existence of European Muslims under the identity of being a European and being a Muslim. I'm going to talk about two extensions, and then first extension I'll tell you why there is a need for formation of a European Muslim identity that is currently lacking, ladies and gentlemen, and overpowered by the absence of narrative as opposed to any narrative. And we tell you that if that identity is the right identity for the European Muslims to go forward, we'll tell you how that will create an educated middle to upper middle class of Muslims that will bring about the outcome that we want. Under these two extensions, we'll engage with the idea of identity that opening opposition talks about, as well as how the acceptance and better treatment from the majority of society will come through. We'll show you both. Let's start of why European Muslim secular identity can be better formed in our way. First and foremost, is this identity that they talk about in public spaces of slaughtering a cow or like calling for azan or hijab in full. Ladies and gentlemen, this public display of identity is binary and absolute in Islamic culture or any other minority culture? Which you know, because we think, ladies and gentlemen, these identities are formed over the time and space with cultural nuances from those time and space. What do we mean? If you look into the practices of South Asian Muslim culture, which is fundamentally different from North Asian Muslim culture, which means, ladies and gentlemen, while South Asians might feel that hijab is an essential part of Muslim identity, but Islam in itself does not say so. This is open to interpretation, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we tell you these are social constructs. And if this is a social construct, ladies and gentlemen, we don't see any problem. These new social constructs are created for the future. Because we think, ladies and gentlemen, this is dependent on space. If you look into time as well, ladies and gentlemen, we think this particular nuances of what identity should entail also changes over time. If you look into the narratives of 1950s, Islam will be fundamentally different from 2015. Where you say the rise of the gay imam in New York, ladies and gentlemen, where there's more acceptance of homosexuality. What are we trying to say here? We're trying to say, ladies and gentlemen, that identity that you are willing to protect by considering all the harms of Islamophobia that there exists. We tell you that this identity is not absolute, it's not a binary nature. And this identity will change over time regardless of what you do. The question is whether we change this in the process of a rational discussion and whether we direct this identity formation in a way there is more acceptance. And we believe this identity formation, if guided by a religious leader in partnership with the state, creates a new identity of European secular Muslim that is far more acceptable and beneficial for all the parties. Why we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, how does the current formation, this brings the comparative, how the current formation happens? We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the current formation of European Muslim identity happens in tension, where there is the silence of moderates absolutely kills, and that's why the extremist ideas actually overpowers that space of narrative. What do we mean, ladies and gentlemen? We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that today moderates are in a limbo where they do not exactly know. Today moderates are in a limbo where they do not know exactly what to do and what not to do. If you see the entire identity narrative is for the formation of entire European identity narrative is crowded by the extremism, ladies and gentlemen, coming from ISIS. Because you'll see a lot of European recruits coming from ISIS. We tell you, why does this happen? It's because mostly these people, European Muslim people, are not the only people of regular European people, but they are also the poor immigrant generation, ladies and gentlemen, in their second or third generation of migrants. What it means, ladies and gentlemen, the second, third generation migrant Muslims never had the social integration. Their families had to work in extra hours, had to do three shifts, ladies and gentlemen, had to work overdose. As a result of which their family integration has not been there, their social integration has not been there. As a result of which they are the ones who have never had that narrative of the rational Muslim belief. As a result of which, ladies and gentlemen, they have subscribed to ISIS, they have gone into internet, and their entire identity creation has been overpowered by an extremist narrative. But we denounce the fact that it is not the extremist narrative that exists in Islam, ladies and gentlemen. There is a moderate understanding of Islam that currently is unremaining. So, if this is true, that there is a moderate version of Islam where this public display can be crowded out within the space of Islam, who should do it, ladies and gentlemen? Should it happen in the internet over Facebook? We tell you no, that is uncontrolled, that is not directed, that does not guarantee success. The only agent who can do this is an agent that is equally Islam, equally Europe, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that agent is these religious leaders. When it happens in a congregation, ladies and gentlemen, it does not give you an idea that state is imposing you. Rather, it creates a discourse that eventually happens on Facebook, now happens in those congregations. We think the outcomes are far better done, and the identity formation is far happens better in our model. And that's exactly why the identity they so want to protect, we tell you that identity is fluid in itself and can be better formed in our model. Yes, Kumar, say your case.
First, why does public have to be extremist, like wearing a hijab? Second, why must Islam change?
One point. So why does public has to be extremist? We tell you the idea that in absence of a hijab, you're not a Muslim is a narrative in itself is wrong, and that needs to be changed in the longer run. Right? Why is it important, ladies and gentlemen? It is important in our world that various interpretations of Islam, which are perfectly acceptable within the paradigm of the religion, is present, and that's where we create Islam where there are more Muslim moderates, ladies and gentlemen. Why these Muslim moderates are good brings to my perfect argument of like creating an educated middle upper class of our future. Understand, ladies and gentlemen, that often Often these Muslim people are the ones who are the poorest in their community, who are uneducated as well. We're talking the parts of Lille or Lyon or even Hamburg, ladies and gentlemen, where they do not get, say, subsidy, they do not get perfect education, they do not get perfect healthcare. As a result of which they are locked into the vicious cycle of poverty, of marginalization, because they cannot effectively engage with the state mechanism, ladies and gentlemen. As a result of which, what happens, since there's no good public school, there's no good hospitals, then no one effectively advocates for them. What happens, ladies and gentlemen, in our paradigm? When this group of leaders starts to preach a moderate version of Islam, state actually wants to help them, right? It increases the bargaining power of those leaders with those states, ladies and gentlemen. States now sees these leaders as the development partners for future, ladies and gentlemen. As a result of which, the higher chances of allocating resources in those poor regions of Lille and Lyon is highly likely, ladies and gentlemen, that it will come through. The redistribution will far more happen and allocate in those corners of shabby corners and the ghettos of Hamburg, ladies and gentlemen. And that's exactly when we see an intergenerational change will happen. The only possible reply is Muslims can do it themselves, the rich Muslims, right? But we tell you, the rich Muslims are devoid of the identity of those ghetto Muslims. Why? Because they have probably gone into an education that does not represent those ghetto Muslims on the very first place. As a result of which, ladies and gentlemen, we do not see any other agent who can advocate for these Muslims and bring and become a partner of development in future. That's exactly how a future changes. That's exactly how we create a critical mass of educated Muslims by these leaders being trusted by the state and becoming a partner in development. We are very, very proud to propose from the team proposition.
Thank you, member of government. Now I can invite member of opposition to extend the case to the opposition. And now, I find it pretty offensive coming from opposing government that the more Muslims become moderated, the more they shift towards an atheist point of view, the more they buy into the secular state. That's only the time where you deserve your benefits. And in no way they envision a world in which you as a Muslim, with your extremely conservative values, with your really covered up burqa, can deserve that same right. At no point do we think that we should move to that point in order to allocate equal rights to individuals, because they ought to deserve it, not because they're less like a Muslim and more like a Christian, but they ought to deserve it because of who they are. So to that extent, we think that if we have to interpret it in a more conservative manner, we're very proud to support that. But I don't say that, oh, you know what, but it's not really a thing, right? Because like Muslims really don't need to wear the hijab. Like it can totally change to something more liberal. That's not the same though, because some Asians apparently are more prone to that. Like, look, yes, your opinion may be valid. Like some people may think that it's okay to do it, but there are two problems with this. One, those people who believe they're okay with it do not believe so because they're under oppression and they fear being killed on the streets. They do so because they have reconciled the terms with their Quran, with their God, and said, maybe I can interpret in this way and it can be acceptable. Not one that's oppressive, right? But the second idea why it's not okay to do that is because for a lot of other people, those actions, holding that physical manifestation of their religion, is a part of their constitutes of attachment, where you tell them, you as the closest person to them, a religious imam, telling you that what you think is important to you is a wrongful choice and you ought to abandon. That's where that's not a legitimate claim for any religious leader to be able to do. No, thank you. Because it hurts you as a person, right? And that's why we don't want to hurt people, especially if you're a religious leader that claims to be able to provide salvation on behalf of your God. You ought not to hurt your people. So we think that's just generally bad. Let's talk about like this thing coming from opening government. Because apparently there's this victim blaming like case, right? Because the state cannot protect you from the rampant abuses, therefore you should just hide yourself and not get hurt. One, I can't see how if we support European laws against violence, against any form of abuse and aggression against any other human being, those laws can't apply to you just because you're Muslim, right? But the second idea here is that we are okay with them like maybe being abused
because it allows us to understand that the problem is real, right? That you're being beaten up because you're wearing a hijab. The same way we realize police brutality is real in America is because you are black and you're beaten up, and precisely because you're black. That people can really around the common ideology that is wrong and legislation ought to change because of that. No, thank you. The visceral and visual effect of understanding the problem is real is important to fixing it. But more than that, it's also the idea that if you allow for yourself to be hurt, these abuses are not going to disappear, right? But they're going to be hidden because now you can no longer claim that my abuse of you was because of your hijab, because you didn't wear it, and therefore maybe I didn't hit you because of that. I hit you because you're just a mean person. And those things don't run away. But then we also say, right, that in order for us to try and fight that, we must understand that to a lot of people, religion is more important than trying to just stay alive, right? That's why people rather die than see the Temple Mount burn, right? That's why people rather die. They don't think that they can make the Hajj in their lifetime. To those people, religion is far more important than just living a life of existence, right? No, thank you. And to say that you allow religious leaders to tell you those things that were part of your identity are wrong is to denounce your faith, is to denounce the ability for that individual to gain salvation to the higher being. And we think as a religious leader that believe that your religion is the all and end all, that's just denouncing the legitimacy of the religion to bring salvation and grace to the individual. No, thank you. But also the idea here is that we need to understand that the only way in which we can fix abuses is to allow people of religion to hold on the association of that religion to counteract the narratives in society. What do we mean by that? We often associate violence with people who appear like Muslims. The only way to do so is for them to don on that hijab, do charitable things, to be the best friend that they are in front of you, in order for you to realize that all those characteristics and personalities have nothing to do with your outfit, and thereby changing the discourse. And to that end, we think that retaining the purity and integrity of religion allows you to do so. But more than that, it's also oftentimes, even if these people are facing abuse in society and they ought to be protected, sometimes we can't protect them. But sometimes the only form of protection is their belief that God is caring for them. It's the ability to hold on to those physical manifestations and say, I can gain closure, even when the world is shouting at me, because I hold on to what God has given me. And that form of spiritual protection is what you take away from them as an illegitimate choice of protection. Closing.
Do you think that the ISIS version of Islam is also an acceptable version of Islam?
No, because it kills people, right? So we don't stop the extreme ideology, not because it's just extremely conservative. It's because it kills people, and we don't want them to kill people, right? But if they really genuinely believe that God is all that real and no one else is real, we're okay with that. Just don't shoot someone else, right? Okay, thank you. The essential curriculum site, in addition to whatever I just told you, is the ability to forcefully proselytize and spread the religion in society in order for you to gain tolerance. We need to challenge people's faith with your faith in their faith, to challenge those norms that they have. Why is it so? Because we think oftentimes the reason why you wear the hijab, the reason why you don on the big cross, is because these things are crucial to public interaction. You can't show that you're modest and humble if that humility is not shown to another human being, right? Those aspects of religion are directly supposed to be existent in the public sphere, to exhibit characteristics of the religion. No, thank you. So we think that it's important for people to even do things like evangelism, to try and discuss and negotiate and convince people that our religion is right. Not because your religion is wrong, but our religion believes in forgiveness, in mercy. It believes in an afterlife that you and I can both buy into. All these things allow for an individual to carry their religious symbols to convince another individual that if at the end of the day, even if you don't buy into me, you buy into my entire narrative that says my religion is as such, including those things I put upon myself, right? It is at that point that when people want to challenge the existing narratives, they are violent, they are wrong, they have something to buy into, there's something that they can attach to. That when they give you equality, they don't give you equality because you are just a person that looks less like a Muslim, but you're a person that has everything a Muslim, a conservative Muslim ought to have, but yet I still buy into you and see you as an equal individual and give you everything that is deserving of a human being. It's at that point that you're able to have imposed presence and negotiate how people are then able to move their lives around you. Yes, we probably think it's a noise pollution when during the Ramadan festival you have prayer chants. But it's only when you have that people can understand maybe we can set it at different times. Maybe let's not shift the volume to level 10, but level 5 is okay. The only time which you can negotiate your rights in the public sphere is if the public sphere understands the nature of your rights and what you demand as a human being as a Muslim minority within Europe. To that end, we're very proud to oppose. Thank
Right. Thank you, member of opposition. It's my government whip to end the case to side conservative.
I think so. Okay. Oh, that. Things you don't say. So in his very hyped and moral high romanticized rhetoric, CEO tried to make you believe that it's extremely important for everybody to have an identity. While we recognize that particular angle which came directly from the opening opposition, we also recognize that this identity is subject to time and space, which is what Rishabh told. And the impacts of that were something that CEO completely ignored, right? He did not engage on how the assimilation that Rishabh talked about, how these particular individuals come from a lower background, come from social classes which have not gotten enough education, enough amenities to develop themselves, to build themselves, and is exactly why these people buy into narratives of radicals, or which is exactly why these individuals do not form a different narrative of identity, which is not the same as ISIS, is something that the CEO failed to engage with, which is why we take this debate over them and overall in general. So what are the real questions of this debate, right? The first question is, are there really stark differences? Like, the obvious answer is yes. Even if you're not practicing in public domain as a Muslim, you probably have an ethnicity that makes you very evidently one, right? There are also racial lines that can differentiate you. So what is the real problem in practicing as a Muslim as a public display of being Muslim, right? The problem with that is the only recognizable elements of it all conform to the narratives of ISIS and the stereotypical Muslims who are radical because their expressions are extremely radical, because their expressions have been so overpowering and overwhelming that those are the only ones people know. So if you're a Muslim who speaks like a general person, like all Muslims are supposed to be, polite and normal human beings, then you're not recognized as a Muslim. However, if you are one who's going on Nara Takbir, shouting that in the middle of nowhere, then that is something people identify with, because guess what? They've seen it on media, they've seen it in different places, they've seen how individuals who are radicals use these particular words, use these particular formations, and then go about doing the violence that they do, which is exactly what people can associate with, which is exactly where the problem lies. So the problem here is not that you're differently, but the fact that you're not being able to assimilate yourselves. Recognize that these refugees or whoever are in these particular situations, who are migrating to Europe, require that the governments acknowledge them and start helping them. We from Side Closing told you that essentially these governments are not damn caring about refugees. It's not that they don't want to help. They recognize that there's a problem. They recognize there's xenophobia, and we from the closing also recognize that. The problem is, what should be the approach to fixing this particular problem of xenophobia, right? So the problem at current stage is that people do not know how to appreciate these particular individuals who are Muslims, because they don't know how these Muslims are supposed to be, because they have not interacted enough, because they belong to a separate social class, because they belong to societies which do not require integration and interactions, right? So in order to make these individuals, make these Muslim minorities able to integrate in societies and socialize with individuals from Europe, you have to recognize that these individuals need to take a first step too. And that first step is behaving in the cultural nuances in the place that you have gone to. Understand that when you move to all of you, when you move to an individual, when you move to a new country, you are required, and you require the government helps you, supports you, provides you all the provisions that country has, because you had a dream to be the European person, because you've been either kicked out of your country, or because simply you are pursuing your dreams and you believe in the European dream, then essentially you need to buy into being that European person too. And in order to become that European person, if it requires you to change your cultural nuances of religion, you do that. But who is the best agent to tell you to do that? Because the governments have already tried. In France, when the government tried, it backfired, because Muslims took it as a threat on themselves, right? The radicalists encouraged that narrative and said, yes, it is a threat to religion because these European Muslims, these secularist, radicalist, somehow contradictory Christians, are trying to not allow you to practice your religion. But that's not where these governments were trying to stand, right? The stance they were all taking was simple, that they were trying to tell these individuals to stop acting first as Muslims, but first as Europeans, first as people who have economic participation, as individuals who can be assimilated, so that people can accept them, so that these interactions can lead into some meaningful integration within society, where these individuals are recognized, so that they have a mobility from the middle class and they can rise on, right? However, this is something that these governments cannot directly impose, because guess what? When they say so, people take it as an imposition because they do not come from the same religion. Religious leaders understand these nuances. They understand what is really fundamental to religion and what is really a cultural nuance of that religion. And that is exactly where Rishad has done this debate with you people. He's told you how the hijab itself does not have to be, is not a fundamental of Islam. The point is for women to act modestly, right? So if the leaders start preaching religions in these particular ways, then essentially what happens is that people recognize, these new congregations recognize that there are other elements of religion, and these narratives can be solidified and perpetuated. So when these narratives can be perpetuated and solidified, essentially what happens is there is a different narrative of European Muslim identity. That European Muslim identity does not conform to the radicalist Muslim identity, which is exactly when people have to disassociate, and which is when they realize that these are individuals who can get all the economic amenities that they require before moving on closing.
If you strip away all visual Muslim imagery from the individual that does exactly the opposite of ISIS, where do you get the traction to believe that they're acting not because they're Muslims, but because they're Europeans? We need people to understand that they're good even when they are Muslims.
People always recognize that individuals are good when they're behaving good. But you have to recognize who are the people who are xenophobic. These are not moderate individuals, because moderate individuals in daily interactions do understand that other people are first humans. The problem is xenophobes identify individuals with these radical conformist identities of practice and public displays. And this not only puts these Muslims at threat, but like the OOO already told you, it puts other people who are around them and not buying into that martyrdom also in threat. But moving on, what did Risha tell you that takes this debate home, right? He told you that it's extremely important that in order for European Muslims in the future to change, it is extremely important that we give them economic freedom and we give them a particular level of traction as the lower income individuals who need to rise to power, right? In order to do that, in order to stop xenophobia from increasing, what needs to happen is these individuals need the government's attention. Who can negotiate with the government? This is that religious cleric who is speaking in favor of the government with its congregation and ensuring that individuals, that his people are going to behave well or different or integrate into society, while government will ensure that these congregation or individuals get all the benefits that they rightfully deserve as people of Europe, right? So as a result, this bargaining chips that stands with this religious leader essentially helps this religious leader to help these individuals out of their poverty, out of their economic deprivation, which is exactly where their minds get to be more open, right? Recognize how then these individuals and their future generations get to go to school. What then happens? Then these children are not subjected to the kind of differences that their fathers and forefathers have been subjected to, because they do not come from a different social class. So they are assimilated, they are integrated, and as a result, they do not see xenophobia every day. As a result, they also recognize a better Europe. We stand for a change that is positive, and in order to bring the required change in Europe today, especially with regards to the poor Muslims, we believe the only change agent is the religious leader for their congregations. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you. Governor Whip. Now the last speaker of the opposition bench was this debate. The House invites the opposition whip. This is known as the
Mr. Speaker, in closing opposition, we had two central beliefs that we thought were distinct. The first is that religion is innately very much a public process as much as it is an internal one. And second, that the only real way to create discussions and change in policy is to get into people's faces. And to the extent that refraining from being able to practice your religion in public is antithetical to this, we're happy to stand in opposition to this motion. Two things I need to ask in the speech. First, is this policy one that is acceptable in principle And second, how do we really best achieve religious integration in a way that is meaningful? First, is this one acceptable in principle? Now, opening government spent a lot of time talking about how religion in general has shown to give up compromise. And I understand, and that's the point of this debate. But the important thing to understand is that there are certain principles that we thought were important that at some points, religious leaders in their capacity should never ever give up because they're core and central to the purpose of these religions. And those principles are so important that even given state imperatives, they should never be forsaken. And this is the point of our extension, that we thought that the purpose of religion, especially for minority religions, is one that is intrinsically public. No, thank you. And here is why. There are three reasons. The first is that the entire point of the existence of religion is to some extent reliant on the public. Why? Showing that your legitimate religion that shouldn't be qualified on a cult level status like sectarianism is fundamentally vital, even if I was to consider your secular calculus. That to be able to continue to exist within these points, interaction with the public, showing that your fair and reasonable religion is one that's crucial to your identity. No thanks. Second, many religions practice evangelism, and there's a reason why. Because the entire existence of religion relies on your ability to attract people from the public and to convince people in the public to continue their religion going on in the first place. Second reason why that's important. Third, that we think the point of evangelism is precisely to spread the ideals that you thought were so important in the first place. Ideals that you thought were things that would lead you to heaven or hell or whatever. And those are things that we thought were important to spread to people and are core to the identity of your public expression in the first place. As far as a leader is responsible for all these things, refraining from being able to conduct yourself publicly was an atrocity to this ability to be a part of a religion. No thanks. What was the opening government's concern? They said that all these things should be treated because of safety. I mean, this is problematic because of two things, or two responses. First, we need to cure this misconception of Europe. No, thank you. It is not the xenophobic, like cult-killing people that they try to get it out to be. Germany, a predominantly Catholic religion, Catholic community, forced its state to take in refugees who were primarily like Islam. First, this Christians, Protestants, and Catholics were able to bind together to discuss issues of separation in Ireland. All these kinds of messages say, and at no other point of time, confirmed especially by the European Court of Human Rights, has Europe ever been more liberal to understand and appreciate the need to balance out these religions as a whole. So the big issue of them saying that we randomly kill off Muslims and playgrounds is completely mischaracterized on their side, as is much of the threat that is seen portrayed. No, thank you. But the further point coming up from Andre is at the point which these people do get marginalized, who are we really talking about? Because it's also true that big part of the individuals aren't just shot randomly because they wore these particular religious symbols as a whole. Because the important thing we need to discuss this debate are exactly the individuals who seek to put themselves out there, the proselytites, people who get in your faces, and these people are the ones that are vital to be able to spread these religions as a whole. And we thought that as far as bad things happened to them, that was a beautiful thing. For two reasons. First, they encourage discourse in a meaningful way that we talked about, and I'll talk about later. No time. But if dying was the thing, then there's a greater stability for you as part of the religion, and that is consistent with many religions. Showing that you died for your faith, creates the biggest rewards in heaven, and that's why we thought those are important principles, even if it got to that extent, was consistent with what the base leaders should be portraying in the first place. So, if it's a question of principles, we think even if it's safety, we think it is very not incredibly like radicals say that they should, take in this particular risk of safety being opening.
Off-bench considered that some form of harm would occur to these religious minorities. Given the extreme difficulty of challenging legislation without resources, why would their reaction to systemic oppression be continue to protest, not to take up vendetta on their own hands?
That's one of the reasons I want to tell you. But you also accepted in government that you're happy to remove every and all religious rights and symbols that every individual person ever had. And why is that okay on your side to not address in all government speakers so far? But that seems to be the fundamental trust of religion, and you believe practice any religion at all. They stood for the removal of your right on a public scale. That is why this extension is so important, because this public ability to interact is vital, and they were happy to take it away without any good justification of why. Second, how do we really create the best kinds of interaction? All talked about how this removes the ability for religions to fight back. We're going to go one step further and say that it's important for them not just to be a resistance, but to be in your face and fighting for those that things are important. Government said that, well, you need to first appreciate you as humans. First extension, we propose the radical proposition that nobody should be able to tell you are less than a human because of the race or religion that you belong to. Any policy that removes this is affirming that particular thing and granting legitimacy to individuals who portray those particular opinions, those facts. Second, the only way to generate meaningful discourse is precisely to get people to understand that there is a wall there in the first place. Their policy does nothing but to hide their wall. If you accept that at some point in the future we believe in the right for it to publicly address itself, this wall comes back. And nothing of their sort talks about how we disintegrate those walls. They were fundamentally based on religious purposes and disagreements in the first place. It was actually, it was not as if I dislike your faith as a human being, that's why I treated you any differently. It was because of your religion. It was because of these things I disagreed with in the first place. If you don't interact and discuss these things, the reasons why you disagreed with it in the first place will come back unless we're literally standing for the obstination of all kinds of religious rights, which I presume the closing government section isn't what you're standing for in the first place. No, thank you. That is why it's important to get these leaders not only not refrain from these things, but to do the things that they want to do to actively go out there and preach these things. It is exactly behind the backs of these things that we can start having meaningful discourse to say that things like bigotry, shooting people is wrong, and why are we doing this in the first place? And those kinds of things that demand and demean the kinds of discourse that is in the alternative to these kinds of freedoms. No, thank you. I want to discuss your case right now. Closing government talked about how it's important to Islam and creating a European narrative, using, ironically, the opening government's metric of how we're going to convince people as a whole. The point, I guess, to say that there's a huge wave of anti-sentiment in Europe, it's important to tide it over. See, here's my problem. First of all, if you thought Islam was such an important thing, why is it not also important for you to create a discourse in Europe that's based upon the idea that Europe has to incorporate Islam as a whole? Therefore, cutting them out of the discourse doesn't make sense. Second of all, we also think if these leaders were fundamentally extremists in the first place, what do you think your policy is going to do? But in the their interest, they can't reconcile this public image policy with the rest of society. What do you think is going to happen? They're precisely going to go down these extremist rhetoric that you talk about. Third and final response is with policy. Even if I accepted the best case scenario, then perhaps some kind of things will be happening to these individuals, and perhaps we will give the people a deal and these like more rights. We propose that it's going to be extremely tokenistic again because you don't fundamentally cure the reasons why they have objections to you in the first place. To that end, they never had any incentive to incorporate you in that narrative because they objected to you in the first place. And to that extent, if we gave you these things, at best we think that these measures be tokenistic. And we thought that Europe and all parts of the world should be able to have that discourse and have that integration. That's why we're happy to.
My